events page if you'd like to register or join in any of our events. There will be opportunities to ask questions later and in the chat, so please think about what you'd like to ask Becky and Jonathan a bit later. And if you've not met the IBIC team before, I'm Sabina Hawthornthwaite. I'm the programme manager of IBIC. And I've got my colleagues Jen Smith and Luana Ivan on the call today too. So the IBIC project, the Industrial Biotechnology Innovation Catalyst, it's led by Professor Aileen Miller here at the University of Manchester, and we partner with Liverpool, Manchester Metropolitan Salford and Liverpool John Moores University. We're what's known as an EPSRC place-based impact acceleration account. It's to accelerate research out of our universities and into the Northwest industrial biotech ecosystem. We're funded by the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, and we're working across industrial biotechnology sectors to create impact for the Northwest region. So our vision is a Northwest region where industrial biotech is supercharging the growth of careers and business and our regional economy, and all the while delivering a low carbon economy. So with our webinar series, we're trying to bring you all the new and interesting things happening across the Northwest region. And today, I'm really pleased to welcome Dr. Becky Jones, who is the Director of Enterprise and Innovation Unit at Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, LSTM. And the unit accelerates translation of research through to market and helps develop commercial strategies for LSTM-led innovations. Becky holds a PhD in infectious disease, as well as being very experienced in commercial diagnostic sector. And she's also the principal investigator on the BRITE programme, which you're here to hear about today. Becky's joined by Professor Jonathan Ball, who is Deputy Vice-Chancellor at Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine. He works in the Centre for Drugs and Diagnostics, and his research has focused on antibody responses to blood-borne viruses, including SARS, Ebola, Lassa, developing vaccine platforms for pathogens such as Zika virus, and focusing his work on the translational potential. And at LSTM, he supports the commercialisation of research and the development of biomanufacturing within Liverpool City region and the Northwest. So today, Becky and Jonathan are going to tell us about the Biologics Regional Innovation and Technology Ecosystem, which is also known as the BRITE programme, which is powering Liverpool's biologics future. And they'll be discussing how they're identifying and tackling barriers to effective commercialisation, addressing the shortages of local biomanufacturing facilities, and building scale-up for capability across the region to ensure that biologics assets can be developed and then can be commercialised locally. And so on that note, I'll stop sharing and I will pass you over to Becky and Jonathan.
Thank you very much for that. Well, firstly, for the kind invite to join you here today, and also to the wider IBIC team for sparing the time to listen in. And so, as Sabina highlighted, we're here to really update you, explain a little bit more about the BRITE programme, which is just coming towards the end of its first year. But just by way of some background, if we can have the next slide, please, Becky. So this is very much focused around something which is close to my heart, and that's biologics. And obviously biologics is a broad church. There are lots of things which can fall into the category of being biologics. My particular interests are around therapeutic monoclonal antibodies, some interest in polyclonal sera as therapeutics, but also vaccine candidates. But of course, you can see here that there are other things which would fall into the biologics umbrella, including things like gene therapy, for example, nucleic acids, nanolipids, and so it is all-encompassing. And biologics are currently around 25% of the UK pharma market, but there is significant growth in this space. So fewer and fewer small molecules are coming to the fore, particularly in infectious diseases. We're seeing increasing numbers of monoclonal antibodies are being used, for example, as first-line therapeutics in many viral infections. 80% of the current monoclonal antibody use is in the global north. That's where the biggest market is, but there is an increase in demand in low middle income countries. And of course, that is something which aligns very well to LSTM's mission. But there are significant barriers that are present in translating research and development assets, particularly those which are discovered and generated in universities, so that they can become commercial products. And those problems are a range of problems across that development pipeline. So there's lots of infrastructure gaps, there's limited scale-up capabilities, limited GMP manufacturing capability, and all of this makes that journey for a typical academic difficult. And so we know that there are lots of potential products which are sitting in university laboratories or being created in university laboratories, but they never really see the light of day in terms of being a medicine that's going into a patient. And biomanufacturing is an incredibly challenging business. It's an expensive thing, particularly biologics manufacture, and that creates problems in that it's a very difficult place for people to occupy. So we know for a fact that within the city region, and in fact probably across the UK, that we do have quite a lot of infrastructure, but it's relatively underutilized, and Becky will go into that in a lot more detail. Next slide, please, Becky. So the BRITE project was funded by Research England, and it was specifically to create a harmonized biologics innovation ecosystem. So really, from cradle to grave, what did we need to put in place within the city region that could drive a biologics ecosystem? So it's very much about accelerating the commercialization and scale up of biologics within the Liverpool city region. And of course, associated with that is upskilling the necessary workforce to be able to deliver that. So a big component is also job creation and filling the demand for high skilled jobs. But ultimately, it's about driving economic growth and regional sustainability and contributing to UK PLC. So in terms of the region itself, we really want to look at de-risking investment into either future scale-up or small-scale manufacturing capabilities, and ensure that we can have a very competitive cost of goods to produce these biologics. And so we really need to collaborate closely with local government, with other HEIs, with SMEs, and with large pharma to be able to achieve that. And we also need to look at what is within the region and what isn't being utilised to its full potential. And we know that there is a lot of infrastructure out there, and we know that there are lots of biologics being invented, but it's just not making it through. So we're really about supporting the development of the next generation of academic and clinical entrepreneurs so that we can position the city region as the national biologics powerhouse. Thanks, Becky. And this is something that I think Aaron, who's one of the team on BRITE, came up with. He loves analogies, and it was very much a thought that the ecosystem was very much like a leaky pipe, and a leaky pipe that we needed to fix. And so BRITE project was founded around some main principles. So we wanted to identify what assets were in the region, but also what assets weren't there and what did we need to create to enable this this pipeline to develop. We wanted to assess the feasibility of biomanufacturing scale up, small scale manufacture, and that meant looking at the design, what we needed, and really how to overcome challenges which are typically found in this space, and then design the appropriate business models that would really accelerate that biomanufacturing capability in support, in association with other partners, whether that be SME, whether that be regional government, so that we could generate a local scale-up solution which would really accelerate the downstream, the realization of those assets. So next slide, please. So, as we say before, BRITE, we had lots of things going on in silos. Nothing was really joined up. So we had universities producing things, RTOs, commercial innovation agencies, but none of these really talking to one another and trying to grow what should be a really joined up and very powerful ecosystem. And so really BRITE is all about mapping out all of those capabilities and then filling any gaps and then making sure that they worked together to produce economic growth. And so one of the elements within the project is to look at whether or not there is scope for a small scale GMP biomanufacturing capability. If you're going to stick something into humans, it needs to be made at GMP level, which is a challenge that you probably don't meet in other areas of biomanufacturing. And what happens at the moment, I've learned this through my own personal experiences, is if you're there with a monoclonal antibody, for example, and you want to make enough to put into a small phase 1 human trial, you probably need about 100 grams of material. However, there's nobody really out there who's got the capability to just produce 100 grams. Most manufacturers have huge biofermenters which can generate far more product, and so they run their unit at the cost that they would to produce far more protein than we need, and that increases the cost. And so the need for a small scale GMP facility is huge if we're going to be able to realize these assets and get them through into human trials. Next slide, please. But of course, if you do the small scale manufacture and the phase 1 trial and phase 2 trials look successful, you then need to start scaling up that product so that you can really move it along and become a more industrial scale. And so again, is where are the appropriate scale-up facilities that would allow us to do that specifically for biologics? And again, what would be the robust business models to enable that to happen efficiently and at minimal cost? And so really, BRITE is about addressing this fundamental question about what makes an innovation ecosystem. As I've said, we know that the region has strong capabilities. It's got established anchor institutions, including universities and industrial biomanufacturing, but there's huge fragmentation, and we're only just learning that through this first year of the BRITE project. Starting to talk to the various partners, it's quite obvious that, unfortunately, the necessary people don't talk to one another frequently and really identify common problems, but also common solutions. And so at the moment, we're currently identifying what those gaps and what could be innovative and sensible collaborative solutions so that we share the pain, as it were. And so we're looking at what the role of NHS trusts, biomanufacturers, clinical trials units, universities, government, SMEs, and also venture capitalists and other funding mechanisms, what would be their role in generating this ecosystem. Thanks, Becky. So I'm going to hand over to Becky now. So it is a bit of a double act, hopefully not like Laurel and Hardy, although I was slightly Laurel at the outset, but over to you, Becky.
Thank you. So I think Jonathan set the scene really nicely in terms of what this project is all about and our goals for how we hope to be able to evolve this innovation ecosystem and really drive that pipeline of biologic assets to full deployment, so they can realise their economic benefit, but the public health benefit as well that we're hoping to achieve. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've done in the first year. So we yesterday celebrated our end of first year of the programme with a symposium that we held here in Liverpool, and we presented some of the data on our first work package, which was all around the asset mapping activities that Jonathan discussed. So I'm going to show you some of the data from that activity over the course of the next couple of slides. I'll just get this to move on. So, I mean, first of all, before I get into that, just to clarify what we consider an asset to be. So in Jonathan's introduction, he mentioned how the purpose of this funding was very much around that realization that so many research assets get stuck within the academic environment. They fail to be translated effectively, and so that investment that's been made into that R&D activity is not getting that conversion to have that economic benefit at the end of the pathway, and that public health benefit and broader societal benefit. So what we wanted to do is initially is actually just think about what we consider assets to be within this ecosystem. And so we broadly divided that into 5 official categories, and then an additional one that I'll mention. So the most obvious asset being the R&D assets that I just was talking about. So, candidates, products that have started life within the academic environment and have progressed along the technology readiness level pathway, but have stalled, at some point in that journey, or have got as far as they can within the academic environment. So those were one assets that we were really wanting to quantify and understand very thoroughly, as what do we have within our higher education institutes. The next asset that we looked at were the facilities. So, the kit that exists within the region, where are the bioreactors and fermenters sitting in different entities across the city region, whether that be in the commercial space, whether that be with some of our research technology organisation partners, so that we actually have a good understanding of what already exists. It would not be a good investment to be funding new facilities with new equipment and different technology platforms if we know we're not actually properly utilising what we already have. So that was a key requirement for us to really interrogate that and understand what facilities there are within the region. We're also looking very much at commercial sector. So, what industry partners were there, from sort of SMEs and startups going right the way through to some of the really big cluster that we have in the Liverpool City region of the vaccine companies and some of the big biologics, cell and gene therapy groups and others. So we did that, we took that lens of looking across the commercial sector and looking at where industry was presenting and what kind of business related support activities were ongoing there. We also looked at, from a deployment perspective, looking at the different health systems, so where would there be clinical trials where you can evaluate these products? What were the portals of getting into the NHS and looking at the adoption routes? So that was another consideration that we factored in, as well as really critically, as Jonathan mentioned, looking at where there was offerings for training as well. We know that one of the biggest barriers to growth of this sector is having people with the right competencies and skills to be able to do the jobs that are going to be created. So understanding where there was the ability to go and get training for workforce was another key requirement. We also had this additional category called adjacent, and I guess this is where there might be quite a lot of link ups with some of the IBIC network, because we have various different partners that are more in the industrial biotechnology, high value chemicals, the sorts of industries that might have links to the biologics sector because they may be producing adjuvants or excipients or other kind of components that might go into health products, but were somewhat adjacent. So we also did some mapping around where they were and what their sort of needs and requirements are as well, because we see this as very much like a bigger picture biomanufacturing ecosystem as the first year's gone by, widening out a little bit from our original brief, just solely thinking around biologics. So what we did was, looking across these different asset areas, we thought about, where are the bottlenecks and barriers presenting? Where do we have gaps within each one of these sectors? But where do we have assets and strengths, so that we could really understand that and baseline effectively before we got going with the programme. So that's what we've been doing over the last year. Just to flash through some of this, so this gives you a bit of a snapshot of the type of data we've been capturing, but we've been looking, as I said, around the Liverpool City region focused commercial assets, and so this is just one of the snapshots that we took around different industry players, and we can categorize them and do filters and search on the type of different commercial assets that exist within the region. So that was one thing that we were looking at. We also were looking at things like the clinical evaluation routes, and once you've got an asset that can be progressed to a certain stage within the academic environment, what's the onward pathway in terms of clinical evaluation, and ultimately looking for adoption within the NHS. So this was some work that we did with our partners at the innovation, with some of the innovation groups, and the Innovation Agency Northwest Coast as well, that we have here in the Liverpool in City region. So we were able to overlay that data. And we also were looking a bit broader at what was happening more widely in Europe and looking at other biologics innovation ecosystems so that we could learn, from best practice, but also identify where there might be opportunities for enhanced trade and business links, also to kind of understand where there could be either competitive aspects or also collaborative opportunities as well. So we've spent quite a bit of time actually making those links with other innovation ecosystems in the biologic space as well. So that gives you an idea of the sorts of things that we were mapping and looking at. What I wanted to do now was actually show you some of the data that we've collected from our asset map for the work that we did around that asset mapping within the academic groups. So this program is led by LSTM, but it involves 4 different higher education institutes in the Liverpool City region, and 3 of those, so LSTM, where we're based, University of Liverpool and Liverpool John Moores University, are all doing research in the biologic space. So we interviewed a number of different academics and groups that were operating in this space and conducted stakeholder interviews and various different analysis to try and understand what was going on within those groups and with those specific researchers. So far we've interviewed 63 academics across the 4 higher education institutes. We were able to identify 90 products across 37 different individuals. And you can see how that splits in terms of different modalities of biologics, R&D areas that groups were working on. Perhaps unsurprisingly, a lot of people working in the antibody space and within sort of protein and recombinant protein type research, but also in some of the emerging newer areas such as phage, for example, starting to increase as well. So it was quite a broad split. And so what we found was that we've got real strengths in some areas, and specifically looking at antibody engineering and research activity, but in infectious disease, as you might expect, with the strengths that we have in the Liverpool City region in infectious disease research. And so really positive to see that coming through, and that the portfolio aligns really well with market direction. One thing I did want to mention was that we found actually that we do have some issues that we need to consider as the programme moves on around some of the nomenclature and the understanding of particular terms, because we would go and meet with some academics and talk to them about what research they were doing in the biologics space. And they initially were telling us that they didn't have any research in that area, and they wouldn't identify as being a biologics researcher. And yet after, some time having a conversation with them, it was very apparent that they were working on areas that would identify as a biologic, such as areas like recombinant proteins or those sorts of areas where they just weren't making that link. So I think that, perhaps there's something there for us to think about in terms of how we try and improve that literacy and understanding of some of the terminology that's being used and what that means to different people in different environments. So we also looked at how the different research activities split into different product modalities. And once again, we had a really wide balanced portfolio across the biologics research space, with significant activity in the diagnostics area, but looking at, vaccines, injectable vaccines, other types of injectables, and some of the newer therapeutic areas as well being represented. So once again, quite a good split. One thing that you can see quite clearly here from the bottom graph that was very apparent is that, typically what's happening within these environments is the research is progressing to about technology readiness level 4, and then we see this drop off. And this is the point, where we're really thinking about translation, commercialization, scale up, moving, sort of beyond that safer space of the academic environment. And we clearly can see that's where we've got a problem, and I think that for us is something that's really interesting to have confirmed through this asset mapping, because it means we've got a real wealth of assets within that biologic space that are just, hitting that wall. So I think definite actions there to carry forward for the further years of the programme. We also asked some interesting questions around what our academic colleagues perceive to be barriers around manufacturing, because typically, that would be an area where it wouldn't ordinarily be something that they would be thinking about, or, that wouldn't be maybe front of mind, considering those next steps around manufacturability of their research. And we got some really interesting feedback in terms of what the perceptions were of different barriers around manufacturing and next steps of translation. You can see that represented in this pie chart here. I think the thing that I found really interesting looking at this data was that, nearly 30% of our academic colleagues said no, meaning that they didn't perceive any manufacturing barriers, which we obviously know, can't possibly be true, because there absolutely will be barriers that will present at various stages around manufacturing and navigating a lot of these areas that you can see represented on this pie chart. So I think that what it showed us is that there's a naivety there, and there's perhaps a lack of understanding about what comes next. And you don't know what you don't know, I think. So we need to think about how we can try and do more work across the HEI partners in the BRITE programme to try and increase awareness, manufacturing literacy. So this is something that's kind of come through a lot in the data that we've been able to gather so far. So yeah, very interesting to have that confirmed through this analysis. And similarly, when we looked at other kinds of bottlenecks in product development, thankfully we were getting a lot of the things coming back that we know that will present as an issue. Overwhelmingly, a lot of the points that are made are around funding and lack of funding. But once again, I think that's something we need to address, because although there might be limited funding in terms of grant funding that academics are most comfortable in applying for, when we look at the funding opportunities, if we go through other routes of, going down a spin out, startup type routes, investment from more commercial sector VC, it's actually quite buoyant. So I think that once again, there are things there that we need to unpick around that perception of funding being a barrier. It may be we just need to try and get the HEI lens to switch a little bit more to pursuing different types of funding that's more aligned with spin out and commercialization. But overall, what was really promising to see was that the innovation assets that we have very high impact potential, in terms of the market size that we could address with these interventions, their efficacy and potential for clinical benefit, the unmet clinical need that they actually are addressing, and some really interesting and novel modes of action and new technologies that we have within the region. So I think for that innovation side is very high. And obviously some of these technologies also have the benefit of triggering fewer side effects. So this was a very good positive signal to get through, but we need to be thinking about how we can address some of those other challenges that we've seen emerge. So that was quite an interesting analysis. So moving back to our leaky pipe, that Jonathan summarised before. So these three areas that we're trying to fix of our leaky pipe mirror onto the work packages that we have. And that first work package that we've been focused on in year one, where we identify assets and gaps, we're largely there now, I think, in terms of being able to gather that data, and we're just synthesizing that now into a range of different mechanisms by which we'll disseminate it, which will be doing interactive maps and some reports and publications, and various other ways that we can try and get this fed back and be able to sort of have that baseline set for us as we move into year two. The second thing that we've been focusing on is around that feasibility of biomanufacturing scale up. So this is the more technical work package that's looking at how we actually can help to design that blueprint for a facility that's fit for purpose and really speaks to the needs of what we think is missing, and what would help to be able to overcome some of those barriers. So I'll just talk a little bit about that briefly in terms of the progress that we've made. So our goal here is really how we can turn these biologics into manufacturable, measurable and investable pathways, so we want to overcome some of those challenges that we know exist. And within this work package, we're looking specifically at things like technical feasibility. So how is this product going to be produced? How can it be purified? How can it be scaled up and formulated in a robust way? So very practical, technical considerations for onward translation of the assets coming from our HEIs. We're also looking at really important topics around the performance and quality aspects. So looking at critical quality attributes, impurities, stabilities, reproducibility, all of these aspects that are really key. You know, we want to be able to navigate regulatory pathways as efficiently as possible and get approval for these products. So this is a really critical aspect that we need to be thinking about, and this is something that has fed into this work package. And also looking then more broadly at the infrastructure, the ecosystem readiness. You know, so thinking, you know, around those facilities, what other aspects do we need to consider in terms of the skills, you know, what kind of support structures, maybe a little bit more thinking about some of the operating models as well. So these are the things that we've been looking at. And in work package 2, our technical work package, it's converting that evidence that we have gathered in the first work package around all those assets and where the gaps exist and that kind of SWOT analysis. Then moving that forward and turning that into things like looking at specifically what the technical requirements are to develop these assets that we've identified. How do we scale them up? As I mentioned, you know, it's looking at these aspects around biological performance and how we can manage that and ensure that that's really robust and reproducible. And we're working, you know, with that end in mind of regulatory compliance being the goal, which is the next point around, you know, what's required to be able to get to that stage where we have that regulatory readiness in place. We're looking at developing tools, you know, particularly digital biomanufacturing tools that can help to actually sort of pressure test and maybe even fail fast things at an earlier stage in that development process, so that we can really focus on the kind of products and assets that are tractable and can be manufactured, and we can accelerate that pathway and, you know, reduce the attrition of things dropping off at later stages. And also looking at if we are to provide the blueprint for this facility, what does that look like? What kind of service requirements would there be? So these are the things that we've been looking at. And I guess, you know, across this work package, there's a number of different outputs that we're developing that we're probably about, I'd say we're probably about halfway through with some of this activity at the moment. You know, we're developing a number of strategic white papers where it's all around, you know, strategically themed white papers on areas that are surrounding biomanufacturing. And the guidance for these is being provided by key opinion leaders and subject matter experts in the respective fields. And some of these themes that we're going to be covering are areas like market intelligence and value propositions, how to improve commercial acumen, technical guidance on the critical quality attributes and other manufacturing and formulation considerations which influence the delivery of robust and scalable biologics. And also some horizon scanning as well to inform on some of the emerging risks, future opportunities, trends and technologies to be aware of, and critically the importance of having appropriate digital infrastructure as well. So these are the array of things we'll be developing from the white papers. We have some activities ongoing around regulatory affairs and education, because we know how important it is to adhere to having everything in place to adhere to regulation, but it's also really difficult to navigate the approval pathway, and particularly for some of these novel modalities of biologics that we're developing. So we want to try and reduce avoidable regulatory risk by fostering a mindset of early engagement and alignment with regulatory expectations. We've got some case studies demonstrating how a culture shift towards early engagement and early consideration of regulatory strategy can help with speeding up the process and the success rate for approval. And we want to replicate that with these types of resources. We're also developing the modelling frameworks, and this is, you know, supporting decision support for models around biomanufacturing feasibility and performance. And this is really around having that appropriate digital infrastructure in place. It aligns very much with the narrative from the industrial strategy and health and life sciences plan, because in biomanufacturing the advancements of tools such as digital twins and other in silico models means that we can shifting towards being a core component of that R&D process. And so yeah, that's a big focus for us, and making these tools more accessible by demonstrating the use case for open source models that are built on platforms familiar to the average researcher in this space. And we're trying to connect early research data with decisions that would be made along that biomanufacturing journey. And I think that, you know, the thinking here is that by leveraging low barrier to entry models, we're going to be able to help researchers support their decisions with superior computational capabilities, with a fraction of the resource that would be required to utilize similar models that are typically reserved for commercial entities and therefore would just be cost prohibitive. I think, and then the final aspect is around looking at that infrastructure piece, and probably the most discussed output, because the information collected through our ecosystem mapping and gap analysis and some targeted interviews with stakeholders have generated the insights into ways we could support the region through physical infrastructure and services. So the process is ongoing, but there are 3 key elements to our proposal. And I think the first, which would be more aligned, suitable for academic backed initiatives, is a space for innovation and collaboration where where new technologies, techniques and procedures can be developed and they can be showcased and trialed, and where projects ranging from troubleshooting to benchmarking can take place. The second component is around having like a knowledge exchange hub so that we can focus on the training and the skills development. And a key output for BRITE is that workforce development piece, as we've just mentioned, and that training of the next generation of biologics innovators. And then this third area is this pilot scale manufacturing capability where we can do that early stage process engineering and product development can take place. And so we're currently considering the balance between these different elements, the extent of the services that could be offered, and it's really important that this facility has to be complementary to our current ecosystem and where we think the gaps are and orientated around that, because we want to strengthen the assets that we have in the first instance before we start putting anything new and advocating for new facilities to be built. So yeah, there's lots of opportunities to collaborate and engage with us in this space, I think. I'm just wrapping up now in the last couple of slides. So as I think I touched on this, but just in the last couple of slides, but I think that with the BRITE program, you know, the funding for this program and getting this off the ground couldn't really have come at a better time, I think, in terms of how this resonates and plays back with the UK government's industrial strategy and, you know, the narrative coming from DSIT and now more recently UKRI and the focus on a lot of place-based innovation and funding bigger, more ambitious projects. You know, when we look at the life sciences sector plan and, you know, the three key themes that, you know, are coming through there around things like innovation and R&D investment, you know, being one of them. Well, I think in this program, we can really demonstrate that what we're trying to do here is turn science into scalable products through the development of the pipeline that we have in the city region for biologics. And I think that's a second area, which is around health resilience. You know, once again, we're really contributing to that through not only the production of new innovative healthcare products, but also trying to democratize access to those products as well through reducing cost of goods. So that's a key component that we're addressing through some of that feasibility and biomanufacturing work. And then finally, that theme around digital transformation. You know, we're really applying this for that very focused, smart, data-driven manufacturing to try and, you know, increase efficiency and improve overall outputs and conversion. And so that's something that, you know, resonates very much in our program as well. So I think that brings me nearly to the end. Hopefully, yeah, that's given you a good overview of everything that we're looking to do. And as I said, we'd really like to engage with anyone who has an interest in this space or would like to sort of connect or work with us in this area. So one of the ways you can do that, so register your interest if you want to scan the QR code and get in touch. We are doing some focus groups at the moment, which are trying to really understand more around how we can inform some of these next steps, some of those capabilities and services that we're looking to develop, the biomanufacturing feasibility work, and then, you know, the eventual facility, small scale GMP facility and similar. So there's a few areas there where there might be overlap. And I think as Jonathan said right at the beginning, although this is a project that's anchored in the Liverpool City region, we really want to understand how this synergizes and connects with the work of going on across the Northwest. There's very clear links to the work that's ongoing within IBIC and how we can create that sort of Northwest biomanufacturing powerhouse. So yeah, we're really keen to link up, I think, with any interested colleagues in this space. And yeah, we also have a newsletter as well. So yeah, but it'd be great to get people to link to that if that's of interest. So I think that's me finished. But yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to be able to talk to you about our programme, and we're really happy to answer any questions that anyone may have.
Oh, thank you very much, Becky and Jonathan. It's been really interesting to hear you talk about how BRITE's benefiting the region, getting people talking, joining everything together and generating hopefully some economic benefit through the jobs and the skills that we need to advance those innovative therapeutics. So thank you very much. I think I would encourage everyone on the call to get involved in those sort of biologics and biomanufacturing feasibility work streams that BRITE are undertaking, and Becky has shared the QR codes. We'd maybe be able to circulate those or highlight them through when we put the webinar onto the YouTube channel at a later date. So we've got about just under 10 minutes left. If anyone has any questions they'd like to ask, please do pop them in the chat or raise your hand. We're happy to take any questions at all. Maybe you want to find out a bit more about how you can get involved. Okay, we do have a hand up. Hello, Patanathu. Hi. Hi, Patanathu. Do you want to ask a question? You've got your hand up. Can't hear you. Maybe type it in the chat if we can't hear you. Hello, Aileen. Hi, Aileen.
Hi, both of you and everyone. Excellent webinar and great initiatives. I was thinking about the sort of the regional crossovers and sort of co-creation of activities in place, and I sometimes feel with the Local Innovation Partnership Fund coming online, that put boundaries back or walls back up between regions. Is it worth looking at doing some more cross-regional discussions and looking at where we can work together more across our boundaries again, sort of really picking up where we were talking a few months ago?
I'll go first then, Becky. I think it was a real shame because I think we had started to have those conversations, and then suddenly, and also with government, if you remember, I know we had a visit from DCIT. We explained the conversations, very early conversations we were having with Manchester. There seemed a huge amount of excitement within the room to make sure that we try and join these things up. And then about 3 weeks later, we get a significant call which says, Manchester, here's your part. Liverpool, here's your part. And I think that did derail things quite a lot. So I think we shouldn't lose sight of that, because I think whilst there will be areas where some people might interpret it as competition, I think there's huge areas where there is mutual benefit if we had those discussions. And I think it would also position the Northwest in a very strong position nationally to be taken seriously by DCIT, by Patrick Vallance, that we can properly deliver economic growth. Because I think the trouble with LIF is it wasn't that significant, ultimately, because yes, it was a 50 million pot or 30 million pot, sorry, but that doesn't go far when they're trying to be very diplomatic and split it across 3 or 4 different projects. So, yeah. The reality is that there's a great ambition, but it's not actually backed up by the mechanisms that would allow us to join up and do something truly ambitious. They keep telling us be ambitious, but there's really very little scope at the minute for us to do that. So I think definitely pick it up again. Becky, I don't know whether you've got...
No, I think I agree with that completely. I think it'd be great to connect again. I think, as Jonathan said, there are real strengths for joining forces, because although, you know, there's a degree of operating in the same space, I think there's real unique differentiators as well in terms of the work that we're doing around biologics and the strengths in infectious disease. And then, you know, that side by side and linking up with the more industrial biotechnology work that's ongoing in Manchester. These are quite distinct areas, but have a lot of common themes that just feel like coming together would be greater than the sum of their parts. So I think that it'd be fantastic to pick up some of those discussions and think about how we link up on more strategic proposals.
Brilliant. I completely agree. Yeah, let's use this as a catalyst to pick up those discussions again.
Okay. I can't see any more hands raised, so we'll just wrap up in the next couple of minutes, just a couple more slides to share. So I did mention we've got another webinar coming up in September. We've got SciTech Daresbury coming. Their staff are going to come and talk about the Science and Innovation Campus over at Daresbury and how they can offer support to start up and scale up science companies. We've got the IBIC funding scheme. So for those who are looking to sort of scale their biologics across Liverpool's universities, we've got funding to help you do that, to get products developed and to get some commercialization ideas going. We've got partnership development to work with companies, secondment, so you can second your academics into companies or company people into your universities to exchange knowledge and skills. We've got funding for proof of concept through our innovation acceleration scheme up to 30k. And then we've got the commercial development pot of funds where you can look at sort of spin outs and scale ups and taking your sort of commercialization idea forward. So funding is every 3 months, the cut-off. We've got one in September and one in December, and hopefully we'll be running these again in 2027 as well. So in terms of what we've got coming up for the academics who have got an idea and want to do a bit of looking at their market for their potential idea, then we've got an ICUR discovery programme coming up for industrial biotech. It's open across not just the Northwest, but the north of the UK, Scotland, Northern Ireland, for academic groups and technicians to take part. So we're running that with Innovate UK. It's open until 17th of July, the closing date, and then the programme will run for 8 weeks between September and November, finishing with a pitching competition for those based in the Northwest industrial biotech sector. We'll be given a bit of pitching funds to enhance what the funding that they get on the ICUR programme. Then in September, we are collaborating with BBIA, and we've got a high-level workshop which is aimed at industry, investors, policymakers and academics to discuss how we can achieve cost parity in biomanufacturing and overcome barriers to scale up. So the event is on the 30th of September in Manchester, and the registration is open. I think Jen will pop the link in the chat there. And looking ahead to 2027, we're also developing the programme for our 2027 conference. So pop those dates in your calendars, and then they'll be there for when we open registration in early 2027. And as always, the team are here to help you develop ideas for funding bids and connect you. So please get in touch, either email, website, follow us on LinkedIn where we post most of our stuff, and we'll also share other interesting things. We can share things certainly about what's going on at BRITE if you want to connect us that way, Becky and Jonathan. And as I said earlier, this recording will go on the YouTube channel at some point in the next couple of weeks. So on that note, I'd just like to say before we end today, a massive thank you to Becky and Jonathan for sharing the great work they're doing across the Northwest with the BRITE programme. And thanks to everyone on the call for joining us, and hope you have a great summer break and see you in September. Thanks very much.